guys and gals. It's your buddy Drew from Living History's Mysteries and Ferocious Feline Productions. You know, for those of us who have studied the era right around the American Civil War and the abolitionist movement, we're very familiar with the Jayhawkers, Bleeding Kansas, John Brown. But who was John Brown? Where'd he come from? How'd he get involved so strongly in his beliefs on the abolitionist movement that he was willing to sacrifice his own life to see it through? Today, we're going to take a look at the history and the life of John Brown. It's a truly interesting story. Check this out. This is good.
I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. Today's topic is John Brown, the famous American abolitionist, best known as the ringleader of Bleeding Kansas and his doomed raid on the U.S. arsenal at Harper's Ferry. Now, if you're not familiar with Brown, or perhaps have just heard of him in passing, get ready to learn about a truly fascinating person. I would humbly argue he is one of the more colorful and important characters in American history. And his story and his actions are integral in better understanding slavery in the United States and the events that ultimately brought about the Civil War and then the eventual end of that, quote, peculiar institution itself. We'll start by learning about his life and the influences and inspirations that culminated in his being remembered and widely studied and discussed to this day. But before we get into the basic chronological details of his life, I think it's important to remember that while most iconic historical figures reach the apex of their fame or influence in early life or middle age, and then gradually fade from prominence, Brown was the reverse. He, in fact, had spent his first 5 decades on Earth in a constant losing battle against convention. He failed time and time again at so many endeavors and remained mired in obscurity for most of his life, only to find himself both a hero to some and an anti-hero to others on the eve of his mortality. He was born May 9th, 1800 in Torrington, Connecticut, into a deeply devout Puritan family. And when I say devout, you should take me at my word. Frivolity of any sort was nowhere to be found in the Brown household. His mother was Ruth Mills Brown, who hailed from Welsh and Dutch ancestry, and his father was Owen Brown, sometimes called the Deacon, and he was of old Yankee stock. Grandfathers from both lines of his family had fought, and one was killed, fighting for the American cause during the Revolutionary War. At the age of 5, Brown and his family moved to Hudson, northeast Ohio, where Owen Brown took over the management of a tannery there, which just happened to be owned by a certain Jesse Grant, father of the soon-to-be famous general and future president. This area of the new country was essentially frontier land at this time and a known hotbed of abolitionist sentiment. This, no doubt, played a pivotal role in the Brown family relocating there, as they had been staunch detesters of slavery for as long as anyone could remember. Very soon after ensconcing themselves in their new environs, Owen became very active in local affairs, particularly those that involved the slavery issue. And he offered his home as a stopping point for those escaped slaves heading north on the Underground Railroad. He also became a keen supporter of Oberlin College, noted for being the first college in the country to admit black students. He would later go on to be a trustee of that institution for about 10 years. As the younger Brown grew into and through adolescence, he became a voracious reader and more pious in his thinking. He memorized each passage of the Bible, and he swore off all of what he considered earthly vices, right down to tea. Tea? What a party animal. He also becomes more and more engaged in the abolitionist cause to the point of fanaticism, as we will soon learn. At the age of 20, he married for the first time to a local girl named Dianthe Lusk, and they began to rapidly grow a family, eventually resulting in 7 children, including a son, Owen, who we will be learning about later. In 1825, Brown moved his young family next door to the very rural area of Richmond Township, Pennsylvania, where he had purchased 200 acres and he had built a cabin and a tannery there. He also did something very telling, and that was a harbinger of things that would follow. He constructed a hidden room in the barn, specifically designed to harbor runaway slaves, and help smuggle them about 50 miles or so to Jamestown, New York, the next stop on the line. Later research suggests that as many as 2,500 escaped slaves may have taken refuge at some point there over the many years of its operation. Brown became very active in this small frontier community, alternately founding its first school and post office, to which he would later become postmaster. But tragedy strikes in quick succession, as it will for the rest of his life. First was the death of his 4-year-old son Frederick in 1831, followed by that of his wife in 1832 in childbirth. As a result of these heartbreaks, his business begins to suffer and his debts begin to mount. But as was common in those days and places, he quickly remarried, this time to Mary Day, a 17-year-old housekeeper. They would remain married for the rest of his life and eventually would welcome another 13 children into the fold. Of these were 7 boys, all of whom in one way or another fought with their father for the abolitionist cause. In 1836, Brown pulled up the stakes again and he heads back to Ohio, this time to what was then called Franklin Mills, now Kent. He engaged in land speculation there with mostly poor results, and he taught Sunday school, and he remained transfixed with his work in the Underground Railroad. It was here that Brown and his sons first caused a public stir regarding their radical views on slavery. After inviting a black family to sit in their pew during Sunday service at the local Congregational church, the Browns were expelled. Brown responded by bellowing, quote, "Here before God, in the presence of these witnesses, from this time, I consecrate my life to the destruction of slavery." While some of his family and supporters quit this flock and moved on to the Methodists, John Brown himself from that day on rejected all Christian denominations. He instead would practice his faith on his own terms, without the interference of people he surely thought to be false prophets. But things continue to get worse for him, and in 1842, he's forced to declare bankruptcy. And this was on the heels of 3 of his sons, Charles, Peter, and Austin, all dying of dysentery the following year. Broke and dejected, he moved once again, this time to Springfield, Massachusetts in 1846. He did so ostensibly to take work as an agent for the Ohio wool growers, but abolition is never far from his mind, and this city was particularly abuzz with abolitionist sentiment. In fact, its hometown newspaper, the Springfield Republican, was considered perhaps the most radical anti-slavery broadside in the land. In Springfield, he seems to have hit his stride, and soon after arriving there, his influence amongst more prominent nationally known abolitionists, such as Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass, grew very quickly, and his militancy on the matter at hand gradually began to find an audience for the first time. Douglass in his notes wrote that, quote, "From this night spent with John Brown in Springfield, while I continued to write and speak against slavery, I became all the less hopeful for its peaceful abolition." Brown's financial woes still dogged him, though, and after meeting the wealthy abolitionist Gerrit Smith, who will enter the show later, he decided to accept Smith's offer of $1 an acre for land that he owned in the absolute boonies of North Elba, New York, which is basically Lake Placid today. This place was so rural, in fact, that at this time it was known officially as Timbuktu, before eventually switching to its current name, North Elba. Smith had reserved this peaceful but rugged land as a sort of refuge and colony for escaped slaves, and Brown anxiously signed on to move his family there to aid this cause, which he did so around 1850. Well, as we've seen, Brown never stays idle for long, and in 1856, this time, he, along with his son Oliver and son-in-law Henry Thompson, moved on to Kansas, not yet the Jayhawk state as it was still then a territory. And this move followed that of 5 of his other living sons, John Jr., Jason, Owen, Frederick, and Salmon, a year earlier. It was there in Kansas, now in his mid-50s, that John Brown's name would be etched forever in American history. Kansas at this time was the powder keg of the slavery battle in the rapidly expanding United States, and Brown went there to light the match. Arriving at the outpost of Osawatomie, he quickly assumed de facto command of the abolitionist forces that sought to ensure Kansas' imminent entry into the Union as a free state. Tensions were tight, and things came to a head on April 26, 1856, with the so-called sacking of Lawrence by pro-slavery men known as border ruffians. Most of these guys were loosely organized vigilantes from across the border in pro-slavery Missouri. This event, along with the brutal caning assault of Charles Sumner by Preston Brooks on the floors of the U.S. Congress the next day, sent the already unbalanced Brown into a full rage that he doesn't waste any time in exacting his revenge. On May 24th, Brown and 4 of his sons and 2 others set out in the night and appeared at the cabin of a known pro-slavery man named John Doyle. They forced him and 2 of his sons outside and interrogated him about his beliefs on the topic and whether or not he had played any role in the sacking of Lawrence. Dissatisfied with his responses, the 3 were dragged to a nearby creek and slashed to death with broadswords by Owen and Frederick, and finished off with bullets to the head by the old man. Next, the marauding murderers turn up at the home of Allen Wilkinson, he too a slavery supporter, and his fate was to be the same as the Doyles. Finally, after fording the Pottawatomie River, they reached the residence of another neighbor and slavery proponent named James Harris, who happened to be hosting 3 other pro-slavery militants, William Sherman, John Whiteman, and Jerome Glanville. But the man they had sought most was Sherman's brother, Henry, known as Dutch Henry, who had boasted openly about his role at Lawrence, but he turned out not to be at home when the gang came calling. Each of the 4 that were present were interrogated at the point of a sword, but for some reason all but William Sherman were freed. He was taken to the shores of the creek and hacked to death. The murder of these 5 men, forever known to American history as the Pottawatomie Massacre, would turn out to be just the opening act in a protracted series of clashes that were to take place over the next few months, referred to as Bleeding Kansas. By the end of it, the fighting would claim the lives of about 30 or so men on both sides, including Brown's son Frederick at Osawatomie in August of that year. Bleeding Kansas catapulted John Brown into the national spotlight as both a virtuous hero to some and a ruthless villain to others. It is indisputable that this penultimate event was pivotal in the eventual collapse of the Union and the onslaught of the American Civil War. Let's take a short break and then travel east again, this time to Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia, which would codify his infamy and lead to his eventual hanging. Though it can't be pegged down to one particular date or a particular epiphany or revelation, it has long been known that Brown had plotted a wider slave revolt to free his brothers and sisters in the South from human bondage. And he said as much on numerous occasions to friends and acquaintances throughout the years prior to his final and grandest raid at Harper's Ferry. Surviving family members, as well as many prominent contemporary abolitionist leaders, all later recalled him quite openly discussing such plans in various forms. Frederick Douglass heard him out for an entire day before concluding the idea was doomed from the start and would end up being a suicide mission. And he was most certainly correct on that one. Never lacking in hubris or self-righteousness, the Messianic Brown himself reportedly said that, quote, "A few men in the right, and knowing that they are right, can overturn a mighty king. 50 men, 20 men in the Alleghenies would break slavery into pieces within 2 years." After managing to escape the law in Kansas, he snuck back to safe turf in New England and New York, and there he attempts to parlay his newfound notoriety amongst the upper echelon of the blue bloods in the abolitionist movement. Over time, he struck his messianic magic with a group that would later be known as the Secret Six. These prominent men were not only intellectually aligned with Brown, they were to become his primary pocketbook for the looming insurrection. And there's another person that stroked a big check as well, and we'll mention her, yes, her, shortly. Now, who were these Secret Six? They were as follows: Samuel Gridley Howe, a doctor and lifelong social reformer; George Luther Stearns, an industrialist and real estate tycoon; Franklin Sanborn, a journalist and historian; Theodore Parker, a transcendentalist and one of the most famous and controversial ministers of his time; Thomas Higginson, also a minister and eventually colonel of the first federally recognized black regiment of the Civil War. And then there was Gerrit Smith, who we've mentioned earlier, Brown's old friend who had supported him in Kansas and now would do so again. Smith was a complex but unpretentious man who possessed massive wealth, most of which he distributed freely to endless reformist causes throughout his long and very fruitful life. One more person to mention here, though she doesn't usually get the credit, is the aptly named Mary Ellen Pleasant, another quixotic figure who was probably the first self-made black female millionaire in American history. She spent her life mostly below the radar and lived very frugally, and described herself as, quote, capitalist by profession and abolitionist by trade. I love that. She was also probably the biggest spender in supporting the raid, giving Brown $30,000 or over $1 million today. She later said that supporting the raid was, quote, the most important and significant act of her life. The lion's share of the funds needed to launch the raid now raised, Brown began to barnstorm far and wide in search of recruits. Simultaneously, plans are afoot to procure the necessary weaponry, which was to be sent to a stash house at a Maryland farm. A little more on that later. He attended an abolitionist convention along with Harriet Tubman at Chatham, Ontario, where roughly 1/3 of that town's inhabitants were escaped slaves. And he recruits some mercenaries there, including John Henry Kagi, a veteran of Bleeding, Kansas, whom he would soon name his Secretary of War, and a 27-year-old English-born failed writer named Richard Relf. He was to be the Secretary of State. All told, Brown eventually recruited just north of 20 fellow conspirators to join under his command at Harper's Ferry. Now, this is a pretty small number. And they broke into roughly two groups, those that were known to him and fought alongside him at Bleeding, Kansas, and those that he met rather randomly during his frequent and voluminous travels throughout the country. This ragtag collection was very diverse on countless fronts: race, education, age, social and legal status, and just general abilities. But they all had fallen under the spell of the man they now called Captain Brown. Well, though no doubt he yearned for more men, more money, and more weapons, Brown decided the witching hour was near and final preparations for the assault were made. He departed North Elba along with his sons Owen, Watson, and Oliver in the summer of 1859, and they made their way down to the Kennedy warehouse in Maryland, about 5 miles from Harper's Ferry, where the cache of weapons were being stored. The weapons that had been gathered were about 200 Sharps rifles, some shotguns, and about 1,000 long wooden pikes meant for hand-to-hand combat. Rifles were distributed to each of the raiders, but the remaining arms and pikes were intended for escaped slaves, whom Brown believed would join the rebellion en masse. But as we'll soon learn, these would never be used and were instead widely sought as souvenirs after the dust of the fighting settled. Their appearance, along with other would-be raiders, were suspicious to some of the neighbors, but they seemed to be sufficiently inconspicuous enough in their movements as to ward off wider concern. The whole gang soon convened at the farmhouse in the days prior to the raid, and weapons were distributed and final plans poured over. Now, before we get to all the drama that's about to go down, we admittedly haven't properly discussed why this site was chosen and what Brown precisely intended to be the outcome of the raid. Well, the location part is pretty easily explained, and that is that the U.S. Armory at Harper's Ferry was known to contain somewhere around 100,000 muskets and rifles that had been manufactured there since 1800. On the face of it, it seems like this would be the last place in the country that a motley band of 20 or so insurrectionists would choose to attack. But Brown, in his zeal, believed the opposite, as the slave uprising he prophesied would be so popular and so successful that once besieged and overrun, the armory would provide the firepower necessary to subjugate the entire South and bring about the end of slavery altogether. And now, what did John Brown really expect would happen when the first bullets started flying? This question has been asked ever since the event itself, and the specific answer, if there really was one, went with him the moment he dropped from the scaffold in nearby Charlestown. We do have many clues, though, expressed through some of his own words and speeches, and later from those to whom he divulged his plans and were willing to admit so in public. It's clear that he felt adamantly, even providentially, that the only way to end slavery was, in his own words, to purge this land in blood. He believed that an all-out race war was the only answer to this ancient and barbaric practice, and that he very openly declared he was chosen by God to bring this about. Throughout his life, he cited the Declaration of Independence and selected passages from the Old Testament as justification for this. It is said that Brown believed that 200 and 500 slaves held at nearby plantations would rise up spontaneously on the night of the attack, join the cause, and temporarily hold the armory. This would frighten all slaveholders in the region to the point of impotence, and then, in quick succession, throngs of others, black and white, would join in and begin a long march further south, emancipating all the slave population along the way. Okay, this is an admittedly cursory explanation of the whole tamale, but at its basic roots, this was the plan. And though he's long had legions of admirers then and since, for what may have been a noble cause, let's just admit it. This was batshit crazy then, and it's batshit crazy now. But let's get back to the action. On the evening of October 16th, 1859, Brown and 19 men advanced under the cover of darkness, reaching Harper's Ferry at around midnight. 3 men, Owen Brown, Francis Jackson Merriam, and Barclay Coppic, stayed behind at the farmhouse to provide rear guard and protect the cache of weapons stored there. Now at the armory, the gang cut the telegraph lines, successfully disabling communication with points in both Virginia and Maryland. They soon encountered the sole night watchman and at gunpoint forced him to turn over the keys to the facility. Soon afterward, they were approached by a baggage handler from the train station. His name was Hayward Shepard, ironically a freed black man, and they shot him, making him the first unwitting victim of this doomed scheme. Hearing gunshots, a doctor named John Starry, who lived across the street, was roused from sleep and soon raised the alarm throughout Charlestown. A curious event happens next when a train bound for Baltimore was passing through, and it was flagged down by the hapless night watchman. Brown inexplicably boarded this train and essentially preached and lectured to the passengers for a few hours, and told them what he was up to. And as he was headline news at the time, most surely he would have been known to most people, but he made no attempt to keep his identity hidden. Why he chose to do this in the midst of a pending raid on a United States military installation is a mystery. Was it just utter and complete megalomania? Was it madness that he had long been accused of by his detractors? Even he himself admitted after being captured, he called this his one mistake. Sorry, JB, I think there are a lot more than one. Despite the telegraph lines being snapped, word of this disruption eventually reached Baltimore by dawn. As work crews steadily arrived for their shifts, they were taken hostage one by one and held in the engine room of the armory. Brown told them that by noon there would be 1,500 armed slaves joining him and his crew. So get ready. Well, as noon approached, it wasn't escaped slaves that arrived. It was great numbers of hastily formed volunteer militia groups from Charlestown and Harper's Ferry and the surrounding areas. And these men quickly surrounded the installation and demanded the rebels surrender. As the armory was situated on a peninsula and now besieged in all directions, there was no possibility of escape, and so the brigands barricaded themselves inside the most fortified building in the complex, that being the firehouse. Over the next few hours, regular gunfire was exchanged, but the militia were said to be as inept, or even more so, than the rebels themselves, and 4 of them, including the mayor, were shot and killed. But the end is nigh, and Brown sent one of his men, Aaron Stevens, and his own son, Owen, out with a white flag. But Owen was shot and killed, and Stevens was taken prisoner. 2 other raiders were soon killed. Charles Lehman, who made a desperate and quite pathetic attempt to escape by swimming across the Potomac, but he was shot even before he even got started. And also another of John Sr.'s sons, Oliver, was shot through one of the windows and he bled to death at his father's side. The whole botched episode was universally mocked when it happened and was referred to as a, quote, broad and pathetic farce in the press. President James Buchanan called up a detachment of roughly 100 Marines who arrived on the scene later that evening. Soon afterward, none other than General Robert E. Lee, then pretty much unknown, appeared to take control of the chaotic situation. Lee was joined by his aide-de-camp and also soon-to-be famous Jeb Stuart, who approached the firehouse under a white flag and urged Brown to surrender, promising him and his remaining band safety if he did so. Not so surprisingly, he rejected this entreaty, and so upon Lee's orders, the Marines stormed the firehouse. After initially failing to break through, they eventually employed other methods and forced their way in, bludgeoning and beating the bloodied, beleaguered few that remained alive. The 7 survivors from the firehouse were taken into custody and interrogated. Over the next several days, the badly ailing Brown was questioned and interviewed on countless occasions, many conducted by men of very high ranking, including governors and congressmen from Virginia and surrounding states. And what's so confounding about these exchanges is the kind reviews of the man that had been so reviled. It seems that despite his murderous misdeeds, Brown did have a countenance to him that left almost all in his presence spellbound. I hope I'm not going overboard here, but I'm conjuring Grigory Rasputin as that rare character that seemed to possess certain powers of persuasion over those that had every reason to despise them. News of the raid brought predictably fawning and romanticized reviews in many circles, but what's really astounding again are the recollections of some of those who would have been his dire enemies. Virginia Governor Henry Wise, himself a slave owner who signed John Brown's death warrant, spent hours talking to him. And when finished, he called him, quote, the greatest man I ever saw. Now, this is from a slave-holding, slave-defending governor of Virginia. Quite stunning. And a congressman from Ohio, Clement Vallandigham, also known to be a fierce opponent, said, quote, Captain John Brown is as brave and resolute a man as whom I have ever made the acquaintance. Even the future assassin John Wilkes Booth, who attended Brown's hanging in person, was known to have remarked regularly to friends of Brown's fearlessness and unyielding strength in his convictions. Well, speaking of convictions, Brown was swiftly convicted of treason, murder, and inciting slave rebellion. I think we can all agree this was all true. And he was sentenced to hang on December 2nd of 1859. En route to the gallows, he handed his final words to his jailer, John Avis, who had befriended the old man during his captivity. And they read in part, I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood.
Welcome back. You know, it's like I was saying at the beginning. If you spend a lot of time researching the American Civil War, the abolitionist movement, the hard work by so many individuals to see the freeing of the slaves during that era, you've heard of John Brown. He was a common man that had a dream to see all individuals, all peoples equal, and no one group of people to be held in servitude of another. It doesn't seem like when you watch this video that much contribution was made. But if you sum up everything, he laid the stepping stones. He opened the doors for what came later. John Brown was a man that had a dream, though he may have taken the wrong steps to see his dream come to fruition. He was a forefather and a predecessor to abolition in these United States. But that's all I've got for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed this look at the history of John Brown. If he only would have gone about things differently. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. God bless you. God love you. We do. And we'll see you out there.